In 1620, while the Mayflower was in Provincetown, 18 of its men sailed in a small shallop, searching for a place to live. They came to present-day Eastham, where they were met by a group of Nauset. After a brief but violent encounter, the English left towards today's Plymouth. In 2020, we remember this first encounter. We explore its meanings for today and tomorrow.
Good evening. I'm Thomas Ryan, the Vice Chair of the Eastham 400 Commemoration Committee. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight I'm joined by Mike Hager, who's living here in Eastham for the last 7 years, I believe. Is that right? And a graduate from Harvard University and Harvard Law, and a little bit later in his career went back to the Kennedy School of Government for an MBA. For many years, Mike worked for the United States Agency for International Development, part of the Department of State, and then for almost 2 decades worked in Rome, founding and then directing an association he can tell us about if you'd like. What was that organization that you were founded in Rome?
When I started it, it was called the International Development Law Institute. Nobody really knew what development law was at that time. We defined it. Later on, after I left after 17 years, they had a closer affiliation with the United Nations organization, so they weren't part of it, but they changed the name to reflect that close association. They called it now, and it still exists, as the International Development Law Organization, or IDLO. We were IDLO, later IDLO.
And later on in life, actually, it looks like your last job that you had before retirement, your last work was Education for Employment Foundation, where you had the mission of helping create jobs for youth in Muslim-majority countries. So you were quite a bit in South Asia, I imagine. Yeah.
Well, we lived in South Asia when I was with USAID. Really, with this last job, it was more the North Africa and the Middle East. That stretched from Morocco to Yemen.
Mike, it's great that you're living with us in Eastham now.
It's a pleasure.
Those are wonderful places. We're glad to have you here. And do you have any, so you've lived here now for 7 years. You grew up in Oklahoma, if I understand.
Yes, Tulsa.
So what have you learned about the Mayflower arrival and the Nauset tribe that was here?
Well, I must admit that I didn't learn very much about it in more than 70 years of life. I got the usual reciting of myths around Thanksgiving time in primary school and high school, and even getting a history degree at Harvard, I didn't really focus very much on this. But living here is a different matter. We become very well aware of the presence, nearby presence among us, as neighbors even, of the Wampanoags, and we're compelled with events like this and other historical events to put a lot of emphasis in our reading on this. And reading this book, The Story of the First Encounter by Ian Saxene, I think that is a very good brief presentation that all of us in Eastham and on the Cape can really gain from.
And that book, by the way, that Mike's referring to is on the Eastham Library website, and also on the eastham400.org website. And there are issues to borrow at copies to borrow at the library as well. So, Mike, I'm interested in speaking with you about links between that moment of the Mayflower arrival and then the shallop with the 18 men here on our beach, the so-called first encounter, to what we're living in our own world, what you've experienced around the world in the course of your career. Maybe one thing, how about disease and pandemics? What links do you find?
Yes, I think it's very timely to note that just before the arrival of the Mayflower, that is 4 years before, there was a devastating plague. It wasn't really clear from my reading exactly the nature of that plague, but it was a plague that decimated many, maybe most even, of the villages in the Nauset region in this part of southern Massachusetts and the Cape, and it must have been an enormous shock, grief-bound shock, that Squanto, who had been part of the kidnapped group, who was in England and came back, when he came back and found that friends and family were not there. And so I think that reading about that and then knowing what we've gone through, all of us, the whole planet has gone through in the last 3 months, it's a real parallel that we've had. It tells us that, look, we've had these diseases, and they've been terrible in their own sphere, whatever sphere they happen to be in. And mankind can be thankful for surviving.
Moving from that physical sickness, so to speak, to societal or systemic evils that happen in our world, we understand, I think, that the history of Native Americans, the Wampanoag, who are our local neighbors, and the history of the enslaved Africans who were brought here over the centuries also, and the experience more recently of other migrants, has not been positive, or means your sense that they seem to be facing, or they say they're facing a systemic issues. Could you want to speak about that link to our ancestors and now?
Yes, in fact, Tom, when you asked me to participate in this interesting series, and I thank you for that invitation, what really struck me, the first thing that struck me in terms of links is precisely the one you mentioned. I see this history as a sad continuum of oppression and failure to understand the other. I'm talking about people of color, not only the Native Americans and the Africans and the African Americans as they became, and the persons largely from Latin America, but other countries as well, who happen to have a different skin color. And what is happening at this time has parallels in earlier time. I'm thinking, for example, of how the anti-immigrant sentiment in the country has created a climate which has been effectuated by one of our government agencies, the Immigration Control and Enforcement. And that group has, interestingly, taken on a lot of the, let's say, the mission of what happened in 1840 with the Fugitive Slave Act.
What's behind all this? Why is it that for 400 years we allow that systemic disease to be here? What's going on with us?
Well, first of all, I think the way I see history is it hasn't followed a straight line. There have been zigs and zags. There have been sins and redemptions. So I think it hasn't all been bad news. I mean, look, we have progressed. There were abolitionists during the height of the slave era, and the Civil War was won by the anti-slavery forces. So there's been progression, but of course, like many things, it's often one step forward and another step back, or maybe 2 steps back for a time.
Well, thank you very much for being with us tonight, Mike. We've a lot that we couldn't discuss tonight because of the brevity of this system, but please come back any night and watch the Sunset series, appearing every night through Labor Day. Mike, thank you very much for being with us. Hope to see you again.
Well, thank you, Tom, and I want to congratulate you and the committee and the Eastham Public Library for making this series possible.
Thank you.
My name is Joanna Hollick. I want to thank you again for your support of this program. I hope that you're enjoying the Sunset series videos so far. Here at Eastham 400, we believe that an important part of history is the lasting significance that it has on our lives today. Specifically, we ask ourselves questions like, what impact does the first encounter have on our current world? How have local histories shaped our lives today? And what connections are there between Eastham 400 years ago and Eastham now? Just as the Mayflower passengers in the Nauset had to learn to live together under new conditions, In recent months, we have had to adapt to new routines and different lifestyles. Just as the pandemics of the 17th century devastated Native American communities, our own communities are now feeling the effects of a pandemic. We are interested in hearing your own reflections and opinions on the way that this history has shaped our own communities and has impacts on our own lives. I invite you to share your thoughts with me by emailing me at jhollick@gmail.com. Thank you.